Once upon a time, in a kingdom far away, there was a beautiful princess named Snow White. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips were as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. Snow White was kind and gentle, loved by all who knew her. However, her mother passed away when she was young, and her father, the king, remarried a woman who was as wicked as she was beautiful. This woman, the queen, possessed a magical mirror that could speak the truth. Every day, the queen would stand in front of it and ask, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would always reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." But as Snow White grew older, her beauty blossomed, and she became even more beautiful than the queen. One day, when the queen asked her mirror the same question, the mirror responded with a different answer. "Thou art fair, my queen, 'tis true, but Snow White is fairer still than you." The queen's heart filled with jealousy and rage. She could not bear the thought that Snow White was more beautiful than her. Furious, she summoned a huntsman and ordered him to take Snow White deep into the forest and kill her. As proof, she demanded that he return with Snow White's heart in a box. The huntsman, though fearful of the queen, could not bring himself to harm the innocent princess. He took her into the forest, but when they reached the deepest part, he told her to run and never return to the castle. "Go, Snow White," he said, "and never let the queen find you." Instead of killing her, he brought the queen the heart of a deer, hoping it would satisfy her. Lost and scared, Snow White wandered through the dark forest, where strange animals watched her from the shadows. She was tired and frightened, but eventually, she came upon a tiny cottage. The door was slightly open, and she peeked inside. The cottage was small and charming, with 7 little chairs and 7 little beds. But everything was messy, with dishes piled up and dust covering the floor. Snow White, always kind and helpful, decided to tidy up the house in gratitude for finding a place to rest. She cleaned, swept the floors, and even cooked a meal before lying down across the 7 tiny beds and falling asleep. Later that evening, the owners of the cottage returned home. There were 7 dwarfs who worked in a mine in the mountains, digging for precious gems. When they entered the house, they were astonished to find everything spotless and the smell of food lingering in the air. As they looked around, they discovered Snow White sleeping peacefully on their beds. The dwarfs, whose names were Dog, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy, and Dopey, gently woke her up. Snow White explained her story, and the dwarfs, feeling sorry for her, invited her to stay with them. They warned her, though, about the queen, saying, "Be careful. Don't let anyone into the house when we're away." Meanwhile, back at the castle, the queen was certain Snow White was dead. But one day, when she asked her mirror the familiar question, the mirror replied, "My queen, thou art the fairest here, so true, but Snow White, beyond the mountains, with the 7 dwarfs, is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen was enraged when she realized the huntsman had deceived her. Determined to finish Snow White herself, she disguised herself as an old peddler woman and concocted a deadly poison, which she soaked into a shiny red apple. She set off into the forest, determined to find Snow White. One day, while the dwarfs were away working, the queen, in her disguise, arrived at the cottage. Snow White, remembering the dwarf's warning, hesitated to let the old woman in. But the queen convinced her with kind words and offered her the poisoned apple, saying it was a gift for such a lovely girl. Snow White, trusting the old woman, took a bite of the apple. As soon as the fruit touched her lips, she fell to the ground, unconscious. The queen, satisfied with her success, cackled with glee and fled the scene, certain Snow White was gone forever. When the dwarfs returned home that evening, they found Snow White lying lifeless on the floor. Heartbroken, they tried everything to wake her, but it was no use. The apple's poison had put her into an eternal sleep. Devastated, the dwarfs built a glass coffin for Snow White and placed her inside so that they could always see her beauty. They kept watch over her day and night, mourning the loss of their dear friend. Time passed, and one day, a prince who had heard of Snow White's beauty traveled through the forest and came upon the glass coffin. He was so enchanted by her that he begged the dwarfs to let him take her with him. They agreed, knowing how much he cared for her. As the prince kissed Snow White's cold lips, the poison from the apple was magically lifted, and she awoke. The dwarfs and the prince rejoiced, overjoyed that Snow White was alive once more. The prince asked Snow White to marry him, and she happily agreed. Together, they returned to his kingdom and were wed in a grand celebration. As for the wicked queen, when she learned that Snow White was alive and had married the prince, her fury consumed her, and she disappeared from the kingdom, never to be seen again. Snow White and her prince lived happily ever after, and the 7 dwarfs continued to be their dear friends, visiting often to share in their joy.